The year was 1940. Europe was falling apart. Hitler's armies had crushed Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and now France. The Nazi flag flew over Paris. Britain, small, exhausted, isolated, stood as the last wall of resistance between tyranny and freedom. Across the English Channel, German troops prepared for invasion. Britain's army was trapped at Dunkirk, surrounded by enemy forces. The air was thick with fear, and the world seemed ready to collapse into darkness. At that moment, when the government itself was divided and defeat seemed inevitable, one man walked into history: Winston Churchill. But this isn't the story of an ordinary politician. This is the story of a man who refused to bow, refused to compromise, and through sheer will and words, rallied a nation and perhaps saved civilization itself. Churchill was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister of Britain. Many thought he was finished, a relic of the past. He had failed before, made enemies, and been cast aside by his own party. But as Europe descended into chaos, destiny turned back to him. On May 10, 1940, the same day Hitler launched his attack on France and the Low Countries, Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace and asked to form a government. He accepted, knowing full well what it meant. He was inheriting not power, but peril. Britain was unprepared. Its army was retreating. Its allies were collapsing. Its people were uncertain. And the man now responsible for their survival was the same man once accused of being reckless and unstable. But history has a strange way of choosing its heroes. Churchill's first test came almost immediately: Dunkirk. Nearly 400,000 British and Allied soldiers were trapped on the beaches of northern France, with German tanks closing in. If they were captured or destroyed, Britain would be defenseless. The entire war could have ended in a single week. Churchill faced the unthinkable: negotiate with Hitler or fight to the last man. Many around him, including senior officials, urged him to seek peace. But Churchill stood his ground. He told them, if this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. The room fell silent. In that moment, the course of history shifted. Churchill had made his choice. There would be no surrender. Then, miraculously, the evacuation began. Hundreds of civilian boats, fishermen, ferries, and yachts crossed the channel under constant attack to bring home the trapped soldiers. It was called Operation Dynamo. Against all odds, more than 300,000 men were rescued. When Churchill announced the news to Parliament, he didn't call it a victory. He called it a miracle of deliverance, yet even then, he warned that wars are not won by evacuations. He looked around at a weary nation and said the words that would become immortal: "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." It wasn't a speech of comfort. It was a declaration of defiance, and it changed everything. By that summer, Hitler turned his eyes toward Britain. His plan: Operation Sea Lion, a full-scale invasion. But first, he needed control of the skies. Thus began the Battle of Britain. Every day, hundreds of German bombers filled the sky. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham all burned. Civilians took shelter in underground stations as the Luftwaffe rained destruction from above. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Churchill refused to leave London. He refused to hide. When the sirens wailed, he would stand on rooftops, watching the bombs fall, his face grim but unflinching. His aides begged him to go underground. He refused. "I must see what the people see," he said. Every night, he would visit bombed streets, shake hands with firefighters, comfort mothers clutching children, and tell them, "We will not be broken." Those weren't empty words. They were promises. Through that courage, he turned terror into determination. He called the Royal Air Force the few, the brave pilots who faced overwhelming odds in the skies. When the battle reached its peak, Churchill stood before Parliament and said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those pilots became legends. But the power behind them was his faith, the faith that Britain would endure, that democracy would survive, that tyranny could be defeated. Churchill's leadership was not only in speeches. It was in decisions, hard, painful, and sometimes ruthless ones. He knew that leadership in war meant sacrifice. There were times he had to make choices that cost lives because not making them would cost even more. He faced criticism, doubt, and despair even among his own commanders, yet his resolve never wavered. Behind the confidence was a man haunted by loneliness and fear. Churchill often confessed that a black dog, his term for depression, followed him through life. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on him. He drank, smoked, and rarely slept. But when dawn came, he was back at his desk, dictating speeches, writing letters, rallying allies. He once said, "Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen." And in the darkest hours, he did both. Then came 1941. The world changed. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, breaking his pact with Stalin. Suddenly, Churchill found himself with an unlikely ally, the same communist dictator he had once called a menace to civilization. But Churchill was a realist. If Hitler invaded hell, he said, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. He knew the fight was no longer about ideology, it was about survival. Then, in December, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. For the first time in years, Churchill felt hope. He told his aides, "So we have won after all." It wasn't arrogance. It was relief. He knew that with America on their side, victory was now possible. Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet Franklin D. Roosevelt. Together, they planned the strategy that would eventually crush Hitler's empire. But the road ahead was long and brutal. North Africa, Italy, D-Day, each step came at a terrible price. Still, Churchill led with one guiding principle: never give in. As the years passed, Britain grew weary. The war dragged on. The losses mounted. Cities lay in ruins. But Churchill's voice, that unmistakable growl, kept echoing through the airwaves. He reminded his people what they were fighting for: not conquest, not revenge, but survival and freedom. If we fail, he said, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Those words weren't poetic exaggeration, they were truth. And when D-Day finally came on June 6, 1944, Churchill watched as the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. It was the beginning of the end. Less than a year later, Nazi Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The nightmare had ended. Churchill walked among the cheering crowds, the same man who once stood alone against the storm, now surrounded by the joy of victory. But even in triumph, he remained humble. He told the people, "Do not let us speak of darker days, let us speak rather of sterner days. These are not dark days, these are great days, the greatest our country has ever lived." He had led his nation through hell and brought it out again. But history, like war, is cruelly ironic. Just weeks after victory, Churchill faced a general election. He was certain his people would re-elect him. After all, he had saved them. But when the votes came in, the result was shocking: he lost. The same people who had cheered his name now chose someone else to lead the peace. It was one of the greatest political reversals in history. But Churchill accepted defeat with grace. "That's democracy," he said. "And democracy is what we've been fighting for." He spent the next years writing, painting, and reflecting. In 1951, he returned to power once more, bolder, slower, but still unyielding. He continued to warn about the dangers of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain descending over Europe. Even in his final years, his voice carried weight because it came from a man who had faced the impossible and prevailed. Winston Churchill died in 1965. The world mourned him not just as a British leader, but as a defender of civilization. His funeral was watched by millions. And when his coffin floated down the River Thames, cranes along the docks dipped in silent salute, the final farewell to a man who had once stood alone and saved the world. But his legacy wasn't just victory. It was example. He showed the world that leadership is not about never doubting, it's about never yielding. It's not about avoiding fear, it's about mastering it. Churchill once said, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts." Those words, born in war, still speak to us today. Because life itself is a series of battles, moments when we are tested, when we are cornered, when surrender seems easiest. And in those moments, Churchill's story whispers across time, stand firm, refuse to yield, keep going. Because leadership, true leadership, is not measured in comfort, but in courage. Winston Churchill taught us that no matter how dark the night, no matter how desperate the odds, one person's resolve can change the course of history. His courage was not inherited, it was chosen, day after day, in the face of fear. So, the next time you face a storm, remember his words, if you're going through hell, keep going. Because sometimes, all you need to win is to refuse to quit. And that was Winston Churchill's greatest victory. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to help others discover it. Share it with someone who needs courage today. And comment below, what does Churchill's story mean to you? Subscribe for more real stories of courage, leadership, and human strength. Because history isn't just about the past, it's a mirror showing us what's possible when we refuse to surrender.